I can't remember the last time I've had as much fun with a board game as I have with Descent: Legends of the Dark. And I mean, can you really blame me? This game has a cat burglar that is a cat and a burglar, a cardboard 3D dragon skeleton, and a crew management minigame in the style of Championship Manager. And yet, as much as I want to pull out my megaphone and yell, "Go buy this game!" I have to temper my zeal because this box comes at the gentle price tag of 175 American dollary dues. And for that many dues, I can't exactly carry on yelling things like, "Oh wow, I love this game."
I love this game, but to tell you why, we have to go back to the beginning, to the mystical faraway land that some people call Minnesota. Fantasy Flight Games, who have kindly provided us with a review copy of Descent, is a company that always pushed board games into bold new directions, don't you know, and gave us a cupboard full of cardboard we now fondly remember. Chief amongst that cardboard was a game called Descent: Journeys in the Dark. Its premise was simple. It's like Dungeons and Dragons, except without the improvisational storytelling. You have a dungeon master, they control the enemies and adjudicate the scenario, and every other player will take on a fantasy trope, traipsing through a dungeon, brandishing a sword or a bow or a broom or whatever. Despite appearances, Descent: Legends of the Dark, that being the new one, I know the naming is confusing, is not a continuation of this line. It borrows the core concept, as in this is a dungeon crawling board game, and it uses the same FFG proprietary fantasy universe Terranoth, but that's where the similarities end. Legends of the Dark ditches the one versus all experience and replaces the dungeon master with an app, and completely reworks the mechanical system. Even Terranoth is no longer the same bland regurgitated bowl of fantasy peas and falls more in line with the one we've seen in Legacy of Dragonholt. And in that, it's the most on-brand FFG thing ever, appropriating existing settings and pushing things in new directions with big, bold, expensive steps.
And yet, believe it or not, the fandom did not take to it kindly. When this script was written, Descent wasn't even released, yet its BGG ratings have been bombarded with 1s out of 10 by people who've not played the game.
But Efka, why would people already be hating on it?
That's actually a pretty good question. Chief amongst the complaints are price, character artwork, and also bad game, whatever that means, which felt odd to me. I'll admit that the Aeon Flux elf art style is definitely a choice, and as we say here in Britain, not everyone's cup of tea.
Nobody says that.
But it's also heaps and bounds above the Dungeons and Dishwater character artwork in the old Descent. Neither has the price argument felt very genuine from an audience that continuously shells out 300 plus buckaroos on all-in Kickstarter pledges. But I guess those do really have to be the reasons, because what other possible motivation could these angry men have to trash the ratings of a yet unreleased game? I guess we'll never know. Or I guess it could be that bad game reason. Talking of which,
let's talk about gameplay. On paper, Descent: Legends of the Dark plays out like your fairly typical dungeon crawler. You control a character, you move that character on a map split up into squares, and to attack, you roll dice. More specifically here, you'll only be rolling a single die that's based on who your character is. Each die will produce successes, surges, or advantages. Folks familiar with Descent will recall surges. Also returning here is the fatigue system, although completely reworked. Let's say you're attacking a monster. You roll your dice, you get 2 successes. What does that mean? Each success will be multiplied by your weapon's damage, so if you're attacking with a 3 damage hammer and you get 2 successes, you'll likely score 6 damage. I say likely because with Descent things are not always as simple as they might seem, more on that later. But what if you got a surge? Well, depending on who your character is, at worst you can convert a surge into another success. Most characters will have an additional effect or even various skills and weapons that translate surges into really powerful effects. For example, if you're playing as Varix, the dragon hybrid with torn off wings, You can spend one surge to get not just 2 successes, but also expose the enemy, meaning every subsequent attack against them deals more damage because they're still salty and vulnerable after that scathing article you wrote about them. And that's the power of journalism. The game is at its best when you've gone through a few scenarios and have multiple options to spend surges on. But even early on, there's potential for hefty decision making. And it's all got to do with fatigue. And fatigue is a system that's a little more involved. First, let's go over advantages. By itself, an advantage result does nothing, but you can always gain fatigue to convert that result into another success. Additionally, just like with surges, various weapons and skills will let you gain fatigue to power abilities and just do cool stuff. But where does all that gained fatigue go? Well, I'm happy to report that in Descent, fatigue works just like in the real world. You soldier on and ignore exhaustion until it's too late, and then you have to tweet apologising that sorry there's been no new video, but I'm suffering from burnout. Talking of which, I'm going to go and have a nap and let Efka finish the teach.
Cool, so I guess I'm doing this now. Okay, so the thing you need to know about Descent is that everything is a card.
Your dice cards?
No.
Is your health dial a card?
Aren't you like napping? Okay, so the thing that you need to know about Descent is that everything below 250 GSM is a card. Your skills are a card, your 2 weapons are 2 cards in the sleeve that together form 1 card, even your character sheet, that's a different size and shape, counts totally as a card. And all of these cards have a fatigue limit on them. Some of them more, some of them less. Some cards even have abilities that let you put fatigue on that card and do something cool, like this rallying cry.
To me, my companions! Alright.
See, that was emotionally exhausting, so we put some fatigue on that card. If a card is full of fatigue, naturally, you can't use that ability again. And in the case of the rallying cry, that even makes thematic sense.
To me, my companions! I'm already here.
Thankfully, as an action, you can flip any card over. Got tired of that bow? Don't worry, just flip it. Now it's a well-napped pair of swords with a totally new ability. So flipping cards becomes a whole thing. Filled up your weapon with fatigue? No worries, just flip it. But then you no longer have a ranged weapon, or maybe you lost access to your ability to heal. Furthermore, what if it's not just full of fatigue? What if it has a reroll token on it too? You flip that card, you lose all tokens on it. Let's amp it up a little bit more. What if it also has a Terrify token? What if it also has a Scar token? You want to flip it because you want to get rid of the Terrify token, because otherwise at the end of every round it's going to put 1 fatigue on it. If your card is maxed out with fatigue, that converts into 1 damage. But whenever you flip a card with a Scar token, you take 2 damage immediately. So which is the right choice? And now imagine juggling 4 of these decisions simultaneously. Just like the mysterious exoskeleton I found in my garden the other day, Descent sheds the familiar trappings of hit things, get damaged, heal, to a more nuanced ability management system. Healing barely enters the equation, with a scant few cards letting you regain hit points. Most of the time you'll be, in this case literally, flip-flopping between powers that find more effective ways to do damage or clear fatigue or maneuver your enemies into more favorable positions, while simultaneously trying to eliminate whatever threats the app keeps throwing at you, because the enemies will keep hitting you until you are out of health. 1. It'll be fine. In which case, you'll take an injury and reset your hit points to full. If you go to 0 again, you'll upgrade your injury to a more severe one. And if it happens one more time, well, frankly, there isn't another time. You lose. This is a welcome and more interesting reprieve to the tropes of dungeon crawler fare. But Descent is also generous. It knows you have more things to do on any given turn, so instead of the standard 2 actions, you get 3. Although one of them does have to be movement, which is really nice. I can just whack things twice if I want to. It feels so good. Have you ever whacked something before? It's great. You know what's better? Whacking things twice. But not in a mafia type way. Don't do that. It's a seemingly small change, but that's the thing about Descent. Small changes that have a profound impact. It reframes the question of what will I do on my turn to how will I do it? Yeah, I can hit an enemy twice if I want to, but will that be enough to eliminate it? However, if I spend an action to switch my weapon to the other side, it might have a damage type that the enemy is vulnerable to. I'll only be able to hit it once, but I'll hit it for more damage. And then next turn, I can attack twice with full impact. By adding an extra action, Descent facilitates a play space for these considerations to flourish. It's like a fun sandpit. I can build a castle, or I can bake some sand buns. But with a lot more murder.
Okay, so the systems are cool, but I bet you're asking why Descent? There's already plenty of great dungeon crawlers out there, and if you're paying Descent's price tag, then you can literally have the Gloomhaven of the crop. The answer once again is generosity. Descent cleverly positions itself for a different audience. If you want a highly tactical skirmish game, you're already covered. Instead, you have a box with 3D terrain, cool minis, a fun combat system, and most importantly, 16 elaborate, expansive scenarios that are completely different from one another. Playing Descent felt less like a puzzle and more like an event. Every time we started an adventure, we had no idea what to expect because so far none of them have been anything alike. We've infiltrated bandit camps, hunted demons, and even rescued miners. And that's only the first 3 scenarios. And that doesn't even quite get across how elaborate things get. With the start of each scenario, you only build the initial elements of the map. But as you progress, you don't just end up with something grandiose on your table, you feel like you actually traverse the landscape it represents. Doing my best to avoid spoilers here, so I won't go into specific detail. But if you're in a rocky mountainous location, then the mechanical design of the scenario will ask you, what does it mean to be in a rocky mountainous location? What obstacles will you have to navigate? How will you interact with the map? This is what sells the cardboard 3D terrain to me. Yes, it was fiddly and tedious to build, but you only have to do it once, and then you can keep it assembled in the secret storage compartment. FFG can innovate as much as they like, but I guess they'll always return to having a cardboard canyon in their box. Importantly, these vertical tchotchkes aren't just here to immerse you. If I have a naff cardboard tree on my table, sure, it might make things pop, but I don't exactly feel like I'm in an actual forest. Instead, 99% of the time, a piece of 3D terrain is an indication that this is something you can interact with. From altars to lecterns to cauldrons to bookshelves, all of these are a not so subtle hint that you can go here and find something cool to advance the story. The very first time you interact with a tree, you'll get 3 options of things to do. But this isn't just a tree, it's a tree that teaches you. A treacher. Every other subsequent tree you'll find in the game will have these 3 options, but every so often a 4th one will appear that's more scenario specific. Elevated terrain works in a similar way. There's scantly a rule that refers to one thing being on one level or another. But if there's something that is above you with no visible way to clamber up, then congratulations, you have just stumbled onto one of the many scenario puzzles. Not every scenario is a winner. In one instance, we found a scenario end puzzle that was easier to complete by just hitting the bad guy than interacting with a system that was so obfuscated, we're still not sure how it works. But this is more exception than rule, and it all ties back to having 3 actions per turn, because now the options are hit monster twice, flip your card and hit monster once, or interact with that mysterious piano and then hit monster once. Or, and not that this ever happened, there is the option to interact with every shiny bauble on the map, and then spawn 17 monsters that kill you. I think that it would be reductive to say that Descent trades in crunch for flavour. Not just reductive, untrue, but there is an emphasis shift and it puts Descent on a different perspective table. I think one of my favourite mechanisms in any board game is What just happened? You roll a die and surprise, sucker, that's not what you're expecting, huh? But in Descent, the surprises come not from the mechanisms, but from the scenario design. You reveal a new map tile, you pull a book from a bookcase, you plunge your head into a cauldron and go, well, blimey, Gertrude.
None of that would work if the characters and the story didn't carry the weight. And in Descent, well, in Descent, you have this wizard with a burning bird for a pet, and it is represented by this miniature. So I don't really know if I need to say anything else. You make your own decisions. Descent sports the most diverse cast I've ever seen in tabletop. It's such an easy win that I'm genuinely surprised more publishers don't go for it. But the team at FFG didn't rest easy because these characters are fleshed out in narrative. The villains are fleshed out in narrative, and the world is fleshed out in narrative. Don't get me wrong, nothing here is surprising. This one is happy and reckless, this one is just nice, this one is Welsh, and this one is grumpy. This one is also grumpy, but a different kind of grumpy. Everything in Descent falls into predictable tropes. The villain, the threat, the world, the main cast, everything is something you've seen before and you've probably seen it done better. But you've never seen it like it's here in board games, and I bet that's more than most of you expected. Descent just straight up bombards you with words, and making board gamers sit and read something on a screen with no voiceover narration is certainly a brave choice. But it also makes the clever decision of delivering the majority of the story through dialogue, much like Empire, the fantasy basketball video game from developer Supergiant Games, the same one that gave you Hades. All these words, thankfully then, aren't wasted. They create space, and in that space, the characters, the villain, and the world can breathe. Just like with scenario design, not every moment is a winner. Apparently, it's too hard to resist not referencing Hanna-Barbera cartoons. But there's enough here to make it all believable. And because I believed in them, I started caring about them. Yes, me, the same old fart who generally doesn't have time for young adult fiction. I can't guarantee that genre-wise you will enjoy this, but I was more surprised than anyone that I did. The other boon of framing everything as peppy and vibrant is that this game is approachable by a much wider audience. Parents frequently ask us, hey, can you tell me what's a good dungeon crawler to play with kids? Well, finally, I don't have to answer with, I don't know, Takenoko?
Certain scenarios will require you to bring a specific character along, which is where you might ask, what if no one's playing that character? This is a dungeon crawler. I saw a character I liked, I put a ring on it, I can't just bring a different one. In Descent, no one character is yours. Instead, whenever you set off on a mission, you compose a roster for that mission out of the available 6. This is once again a genius decision that I'm surprised more games haven't been doing all along. I like playing a character, but you know what I like more? Playing more characters. If you ever played Gloomhaven and were like, I like this character, but I'm 17 scenarios away from retiring it and I'd really like to try something new, you'll know exactly what I mean. Pro tip, if you see someone else play as, let's say, Chance, and they do something cool like hit a monster for 20 damage, and you're like, I want to play that character now, just say, hey, is it my turn to take a chance on chance? They'll not only be amused by your witticism, but also morally obligated to pass that character along, no matter how much they would hate to part with them. Exploring different character combinations adds another layer to Descent strategy. Finding a pairing that works is fun. Tinkering with that pairing is better yet because of the game's crafting system. When you explore new environments or defeat monsters, you'll get rewards. Sometimes that reward is just straight up money, but more often than not, you will get crafting materials. Those materials can be fed into recipes that will let you create new items, or better yet, item components. Each weapon has 2 parts that can be upgraded with various things you've crafted. These upgrades are not represented with physical components and will only activate once out of every so often. After a few scenarios, you'll have enough upgrades to customize your roster with different abilities, complementing whatever character loadout you're deploying. And that is where things get really spicy. The potential for combinations is ludicrous. If you are so inclined to take chance with you, you can give him an upgrade that only hits about 25% of the time, but it will net you an extra success for every negative condition on that enemy. That in itself is already ludicrous, but then you compare him with a character whose weapons or skills can impose conditions, and then that character's weapons can be customized to impose more conditions, up to a potential limit of 8. Best yet, because these abilities aren't represented with physical components, you're not sinking in a quagmire of cards that would turn this fighting adventure into an accounting adventure. If you're keeping track of all that in your head, then my word, the tension is out of this world, because there's a chance that everything is going to come up Millhouse. And if you're not, well, then every so often you get a lovely murder present. I haven't had this much fun tinkering with a squad since XCOM 2. Which brings us to the Achilles Heel. And yes, it is the app, and no, it's not what you think. Sure, if you're a purist and can't stand the idea of computer-assisted board games, you were never going to buy this anyway, and I'm not here to convince you. Go live your life. Be free. But if you want my sincere opinion, this app is great. It's robust, makes everything concise and clear, and simplifies a lot of the stuff that clogs up dungeon crawling systems. I know that the upcoming sequel to Gloomhaven will have crafting and let you gather components, and initially I was all like, bring it! But now I've had the app track all that stuff for me, I'm not sure I want the hassle of dozens of cards on my table that have no direct use in combat. It's just clutter. I like that the app is generous with the undo button. I like that each miniature can represent different monsters. I like that it keeps track of various conditions and calculates damage, and I like that it obfuscates what the monsters are actually doing, making me learn through experience. The first time I encountered this Fae thing, I was like, how hard can it be? And then the app said it was doing something with its arms, and I was like, okay, whatever. And then I hit it. Trust me, never again. It reminds me a lot of the Journeys in Middle-earth app, but only in that it makes that app look like a total embarrassment of a trial run. Each monster feels distinct, the story is much better. There's a line of sight tool, there's various mini narrative events, your characters have a whole narrative progression system and an achievement system that unlocks new skill cards. There is just so much. And because of it, Descent can go wide and deep at the same time, and all of these systems still feel manageable. If they printed it all onto cardboard, I genuinely doubt my table could take the weight of this game. But Descent is just too easy. I want to be very careful and very specific here, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with games being easy, but I don't think Descent's intention was to be that easy. There are 4 difficulties in Descent: Journey, Standard, Heroic and Warfare. We started the game with Standard, which I think is the intended general difficulty, and in one instance I did indeed run around spawning every enemy in the scenario. And guess what happened? Nothing. It wasn't really even a challenge. Heroic isn't much harder than that, and Warfare won't forgive you silly decisions, but is otherwise manageable. I think it's really great that there's a broad range of difficulties. I think it's exceptionally welcoming to have a difficulty with almost no chance of failure. And I really like that you can switch difficulties for each scenario. But I did miss the game being challenging and making me work for it. And I think the broad range of difficulties intend to offer just that, a broad range of experiences for a broad range of people, but it misses out on one of these ranges. Look, FFG, Warfare was cute, but upping the damage and defense of your monsters isn't going to cut it when the actual difficulty of the game is more reliant on the scenario that you're playing rather than the difficulty you're playing it at. You might say, hey, that's more of a scenario design problem. What has the app got to do with it? Well, everything. If there was ever an advantage to having an app-driven board game, it's that things can be fine-tuned and difficulty increased. We'd really love to see some scenarios with updates that offer more challenging versions. And maybe an indicator that a particular scenario is more challenging than the average one, since if you do decide to up the difficulty and fail, there's no replaying it. If you're really into Gloomhaven for the burn, then maybe hold off on Descent until you see that happen.
And finally, the bane of all dungeon crawlers. The rulebook. Bad rulebooks in fantasy romps have become somewhat of an industry cliche, but I'm genuinely shocked at how poorly structured the rule set for Descent is, especially from the company that paved the way for excellent rulebook writing. This thing is fine, and fine would be fine if that's all it was. But these rules are like an iceberg, with this booklet just being the tip, and the rest of the rules existing in a rules compendium that, as of writing, is only accessible in the app. Which again would be fine if A, I could print it out, B, it wasn't nearly impossible to access during combat, and C, if it didn't have half the rules missing anyway. Let's take a look at potions as an example. If you craft a potion recipe, every player will get one copy of that potion as long as there's enough in the card pool. That's pretty simple, right? But then, during scenarios, you might get a potion that you don't have a recipe for. Do you get to keep it at the end if you don't use it? If you do, who can use it next? Since the inventory is shared between all players between scenarios, can any player use it or just the person who got it? I found out the answer, but only by the privilege of asking the designer directly. And this is just one example. The rulebook is laden with ambiguity, and it's genuinely quite frustrating looking things up in the app. And its structure is Byzantine on a good day. Honestly, for $175, I expected a little bit more. Unless Descent is one of those games with a living rulebook, in which case my request is, please don't. It's a very old school grognardy approach to game design, and most people hate it. And that's it. That's the review.
What about all the other stuff?
What other stuff?
Like how there's too much reading, or how it's so reliant on the app that it feels like a video game.
Well, we didn't find any of those to be true.
Oh yeah. So is Descent great? Should they buy it?
I mean, yeah, if they want to. Did you like it?
Of course I did.
Would you buy it?
If I'm too cheap to buy new socks when they have holes in, I just mend them.
So that's a yes then.
Absolutely, but that's because Descent is the right game for me, just like Gloomhaven is the right game for some, or Too Many Bones is the right game for some, or all three together are the right game for some. Anywho, I'm not being responsible for anyone that spends $175 on this only to hate it. They can make their own decisions, they're grown-ups.
And I guess that's it. You might be wondering what to do next. Well, you could fold up the laundry, or I bet you haven't cleaned out your sink in a while. And if those don't sound exciting, you can watch one of our other videos. I bet that's a lot better than washing out your sink. You could also support us on Patreon. You'll get access to bonus videos like my series on my top 97 games of all time, and also access to a patron-only Discord server. And finally, you'll have your name added to this list of wonderful people who have already done that. Bye-bye.
Hello, you! Hello, you! Hello, you! Oh, she really scratched my eyeball. Hello, you, good girl. Hello, good morning. Hello, you, good girl. Oi, Jojo. Oi, Jojo.
That's brilliant.